Right, we're entering the next panel discussion of data sharing, legal and ethical aspects in brain research. I would like to give you a little bit introduction to that. As we have heard several times today, brain research in Europe is a rapidly evolving field, and research programs by the European Commission and on national level promote the field increasingly at the forefront of science. As a funding network, Neuron has funded international research consortia to develop novel tools and approaches to advance the understanding of unknown basic brain functions, as well as working on the ethical, legal, and societal aspects of neuroscience. The complexity of physiological brain functions and brain diseases will be a driver for further discovery and innovation. But despite the generation of considerable amounts of knowledge and innovative approaches, the transition into new health interventions is rather scarce. Effective and efficient collaboration and cooperation are often identified as key factors to achieve full impact from brain research. In particular, there is a constant need for strengthening the information flow and accelerating the exchange of experience. There has been growing recognition of the need to address inefficiencies of the research process to avoid useless, unethical, and costly repetition, and to maximize the return of investment in research and development by facilitating the translation of results into innovations. These objectives can be pursued by increasing the openness and the transparency of all steps of the research process, thus increasing the likelihood that results will be valid and therefore reliable and also reusable. Research is usually conducted across different sites and institutions, as we particularly know in Neuron, and relying on the exchange of complex protocols, materials, and expensive machinery to generate data. That requires data sharing, also for future utilization of data and results, and that must also be based on solid ethical and legal instrumentation. We will therefore discuss this very complex field today with Professor Dr. Daniel Strech. He is Professor for Bioinformatics at the University of Medicine in Berlin and Vice Director of the Quality Ethics and Translational Center at the Berlin Institute of Health, with Dr. Wiebke Löbker. She is from the Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices and also coordinator of the European project strengthening training of academia in regulatory science. Our partner is also Professor Dr. Jacques Demotes. He is here from the European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network. And we have Dr. Thomas Steckler. He's providing us with the industrial perspective from Janssen Pharmaceutica. He's also involved in the European Quality in Preclinical Data project. So, and we now have the pleasure to hear Daniel Strech's introduction. As mentioned before, he is Professor for Translational Bioethics at the Charité Berlin and leads the Berlin Institute for Health Quest Center for Transforming Biomedical Research as Vice Director of a large group. Professor Strech is an international renowned expert for ethical and regulatory issues in preclinical and clinical research and also for the huge field of big data. Daniel, the floor is yours.
So now I hope my audio is also...
Yeah, everything working fine.
And you see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, then thank you. Thank you, Hella, again for inviting me to contribute here, this time as for the introduction of this very interesting panel. I say so because we had a panel yesterday that addressed also at least parts of this, as you already said, complex topic. Yesterday, together with my colleague Ulrich Dürnagel, we had 40 minutes to introduce. Now I have 5 minutes, and I I try to do so in really just 2-3 slides to give some background for, as you said, the complex debate. Now my slides, so to make it very easy, one way is maybe to say about a decade ago, a debate started. Of course, it's always more complex, but in a certain way, a big debate started because different representatives from the pharmaceutical industry, here's an example from Bayer Healthcare, published papers that finally said, we have really challenges to believe in the preclinical data from the academic labs that inform our drug development. We try to reproduce these results that are published in Nature and Science, but we are in most cases, in 90%, unable to reproduce this. And of course, again, much more complex, but I think one can break it down and say what they say the challenges are with regard to the academic preclinical world is one thing, publication bias. There is an overly positive reporting of the results. We assume, we as representatives, and assume there are also undesired results that we often do not see in the published literature. And second point, from what we see, if things are published, then we often see that the preclinical studies lack several measures that would help to increase the validity, especially the internal validity, such as randomization, blinding, sample size calculation. Because this is the case, there is most probably a substantial overstatement of preclinical efficacy when we look on the published literature alone. And this has an impact. It might have, of course, not the only, but a substantial impact on the fact that we see a very high attrition rate in clinical research, especially in phase 2, where we have the highest attrition rate, where we for a first time assess efficacy of new potential drugs. And if this is the case, then we just are confronted with, at least partly, insufficient protection of trial participants that may participate in clinical research that is not justified by preclinical research as it should do. It might slow down innovation because we often go into trial portfolios and trial tracks that we could have stopped earlier. And it's also a challenge for animal research if the results of important animal studies are finally not published. So this was a certain substantial critique, of course. In the years that came after this, the researchers were asked, is this true? I mean, Nature, for example, asked their readers and their authors in a big survey, are these concerns true? Is there a reproducibility crisis in our field? And the red parts of the circle are the yes responses. Yeah. The vast majority responded, 90% yes, we have this crisis in our field. So if this is the case, you might say, then you probably know where the problem is, so fix it. Why haven't we fixed all this over the past 10 years? And then you come back to the important stakeholder groups that all have to play their role in improving this field. And there are probably two challenges that play a major part. This is one picture from a Nature paper in 2015 that tried to illustrate that funders and journals, of course, have to do their job, but there is already a lot of things going on from the funder and the journal side. The panel today is such an example, I would say. The researchers have to change certain practices, of course, but the institutions, the academic institutions, university medical centers, still fail with regard to good responses to this crisis. Second, I take this picture from another Nature paper published in 2007 that described why we should, but often do not, consider preclinical efficacy before first in human trials. And in a certain way, just to match this, I would say it's not only the institutions, it's also oversight bodies, regulatory authorities and IRBs that must do their part for reproducibility. So with some bullet points here. What do I mean? What might be the role of university medical centers in all this? University medical centers, medical faculties are of course drivers for academic career, for tenure. They have performance-oriented funding schemes and so on. Currently, this is all done. The primary indicators are impact factor, citation metrics, third-party funding, and if you have networks. All these things do not fix the problem I described at the first slide. Institutions could, of course, reward robust study designs, data sharing, pre-registration of protocols, and use this for performance-oriented funding, for selecting professors and so on. It might help a lot with fixing the problem, but currently this is not happening. If you do this career-wise, funding-wise, it not necessarily pay off. So the question is here, what universities are first movers? I can say that at Charité, a lot of these things are currently happening, but of course we need many, many universities engaging here. And one slide also for the oversight part. What do I mean here especially? Of course, the oversight, when you come about to apply for clinical studies, first in human phase 2 studies, you go to the authorities, to IRBs, present them the creme de la creme of your preclinical results. It's more or less the showdown of all the basic and preclinical development results is presented in the so-called investigator brochures. And then the authorities review this and decide on whether you can conduct these trials or not. But recent studies I was involved here showed that the investigator brochures do not tell more or less anything about the quality, the robustness of the preclinical studies. You have no ideas when you read investigator brochures whether randomization, blinding, sample size calculation was going on. You even don't know whether you see the complete picture of animal studies or just a selection of results. So trial oversight bodies most probably currently do not review the quality of preclinical efficacy studies, especially. Therefore, last slide, next to the fact that funders and journals need to play a role, it's important to really come forward here, and I think we will discuss parts of this. If institutions reward reproducibility, and if oversight bodies, of course, should require reproducibility. Yeah, this was my, my attempt to briefly introduce in this complex topic.
All right. Well, thank you for this clear and slightly provocative statement. That is a very good opening. And I would like to ask Thomas, as you represent the industrial perspective as Associate Director for Bioresearch, Quality and Compliance, Non-Clinical Quality Risk Management at Janssen Pharmaceutica, and as Project Leader of the European Quality Preclinical Data Consortium. How do you perceive the current situation and degree of data sharing that also depends proportionally on the reproducibility of results?
Thanks, Heather. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very good. Yeah, thanks, Heather, for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion. I think, first of all, that many scientists in the field of neuroscience will agree with the importance of data sharing, and the willingness to share data is increasing, but nevertheless, there is still a long way to go, and many researchers will still have concerns preventing them from sharing their data. There are worries that they lose control over what happens to the data, that data may be misrepresented, that their competitive advantage is lost, and that they may be scooped by other scientists using the data. On top, when it comes to clinical data, people are often concerned that subjects can be re-identified. Data sharing is also perceived as involving considerable efforts and costs, and often people are unclear how best to share their data. What I think is needed are clear incentives that produce win-win situations for data sharing and the creation of an enabling infrastructure that makes data sharing easy and secure. I would agree with Daniel that a change in key performance indicators for the evaluation of academic excellence and performance-oriented funding to include data sharing and pre-registration would be a first important step. Another strong incentive, in my view, is a scientific one, and that's the possibility to analyze large sets of shared data that allows more reliable conclusions about scientific discoveries, or to even make new discoveries, which would be impossible to do with small data sets generated by individual labs. It also indeed ties in with the reproducibility discussion we have seen over the last years, and that was mentioned by Daniel. Small individual studies are at inherent risk for false discoveries. This can be at least in part addressed by analysis of larger data sets. Full disclosure of all data, better reporting of study and analysis details also allows others to truly reproduce and reconstruct individual studies, and helps to better understand the quality of a study. There could also be a more important role for regulators here, as pointed out by Daniel. Also, I think we have to be clear that this only covers a fraction of the huge field of preclinical work. Most preclinical neuroscience studies will not make it into investigator brochures or other documents relevant to regulators, yet many of them get published in scientific journals. Industry invests heavily in artificial intelligence and the analysis of large data sets at the moment, and also has increasingly more external partnerships to generate data. It therefore is important to realize that for industry it is vital to have data of highest quality, whether they were generated internally or externally, as those data will form the basis for decision whether to further invest in a project on a new therapeutic target, or better to stop early. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are very happy to have a regulator here on board. So Wiebke is coordinator of the European Action on Strengthening Training of Academia in Regulatory Side, and also as head of the Unit of Innovation and Change Management at the German Federal Institute for Drugs and Medical Devices. We have heard now about investigator brochures, and I do remember from your morning talk that this is also in STARS, one of the pilot projects. Where do you see the most important changes and particular challenges for transnational multilateral research?
Yeah, thank you, Hella. I think that is exactly the main question we are currently addressing in the Commission-funded project, the Coordination and Support Action STARS, strengthening training on academia and regulatory knowledge and supporting regulatory advice. So the overarching goal of our STARS project is to reach out to researchers, to innovators, to bridge the regulatory knowledge gap and to enhance the multi-directional dialogue between all of the stakeholders. So amongst academic researchers, but also together with regulators, industry representatives and funders, of course, patient representatives, and also health technology assessment, to bring them all together in order to facilitate the implementation of academic research findings into clinical practice, and thus to close the gap between basic research and patient treatment. One of the major challenges we identified so far, and the gaps that needs to be addressed for successful translational research and also for generation of high quality data, is first of all to ensure sufficient knowledge of the regulatory landscape and all of the regulatory requirements, for example, for non-clinical, but also later on for clinical data generation. And to improve the awareness of support activities like the guidance documents, for example, and also the advice procedures offered by regulators. We have seen so far in our project, for example, by a lot of surveys we have launched and also by contacts with the academia field, that the awareness of support activities, of support services itself offered by us, and for example, the added value for researchers asking for these advices or other support activities, for example, starting with easy to contact units like the innovation offices at the national competent authorities, for example, for simple questions, or scientific advice meetings, special schemes like the PRIME scheme offered by the EMA, or other support activities like fee waivers for academic researchers or other incentives, for example, for orphan drugs. Here the awareness is very limited, and the lack of attention to these regulatory or also ethical issues might later make regulatory authorities reluctant to accept research findings or might be detrimental when attempting to attract investigators. So the early exchange with regulators and among each other on development programs is fundamental. Reproducibility and reliability can hamper the recognition and utilization of research findings because there is often less emphasis on quality control and implementation of best practices, just because the relevance of research activities for investigators and later on for regulatory decisions are unclear at the beginning, the starting point of many research programs. So to summarize it in a nutshell, I think the multidirectional communication and interaction to improve the understanding of each perspective and of the regulatory requirements is, from my point of view, a crucial point in the translation of research results into health interventions.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to pick up one particular item of what you said that guides us to the conduction of clinical trials, because that is indispensable for scientific evidence of medical data. Jacques, as director of the European Clinical Research Infrastructure Network, how do you perceive the current degree of data sharing? I understand that within a clinical trial, data sharing is supposed to be a must. But how well is the integrity of data when projects or proposals or approaches come to ECRIN and your consultation for moving forward for a clinical trial?
Thank you, Ella. So I think this is a good question. When a project comes to ECRIN, we have a scientific board in charge of assessing the methodological and scientific soundness of the project. And one of the first criteria for acceptance of the project is transparency criteria. And these transparency criteria correspond to 3 steps. The first one is the registration of the protocol. The second one is that there should be a commitment to publish irrespectively of the outcome of the trial. And the third one is the commitment to share the data after completion of the trial. So this is something critical, because this data sharing is a tool for first to enable secondary analysis, second to enable meta-analysis, but most importantly in the debate today is to ensure the possibility for reanalysis, which is critical to ensure the reproducibility of the outcome of the trial. And this raises some problems, however, especially in the European context, because we are covered by the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, and the provision of the GDPR makes it difficult to share the data. Meaning, if you are in the US, you use the so-called HIPAA rule, by which you can just have to remove 18 items to consider your data set as de-identified, and then you can share the data. But in Europe, it's different, because now the definition of anonymization according to the GDPR should take into account the risk of re-identification, and this makes this exercise very difficult, and it is the reason why in the COVID context, the Commission asked us to develop an instrument for COVID-19 trial data sharing, and we are currently performing this this development together with partners in Norway, and it means that we will have the first pilot available in 2 months of time, and this instrument will be able to share the data either as pseudonymized data or as anonymized data in a secure environment. And once it will be done for COVID trial, it can be then expanded to all the different fields, including neuroscience, of course.
Oh, wow, that sounds really promising. I would like to bridge a little bit to the issue of communication and collaboration. As in most European research programs and in the EC-funded research itself, NEURON requires the submission of data management plans from the funded consortia. A DMP is understood as a living document that can be annually updated during the funding period of the projects and is eventually submitted for publication. NEURON implemented this instrument to improve transparency, which we understand as underlying principle of reproducibility and data sharing. Thomas, we have heard that training in regulatory science is of utmost importance. So what else, besides this data sharing and the mass across for the funders, what else can the different parties, particularly researchers and funders, do specifically to reinforce data sharing? Do scientists need training of how to improve research approaches for robust research?
Yeah, indeed, I think funders play an important role here, and I think they can provide both a carrot and a stick. As you say, many funders already require a data management plan and made data sharing mandatory, but I think they must also provide the financial resources required and ideally should provide the infrastructure for data sharing. They should give advice on data sharing platforms that already exist and could even consider setting up a dedicated platform for those that receive their funding. There's also a need for greater awareness, especially amongst preclinical neuroscientists, of the benefit of data sharing and of the possibilities how to easily and securely make data available. This requires training indeed, not only in regulated science, but also, and in particular, in the non-regulated science. Also here, funders can play an important role by supporting the development and implementation of training programs on research rigor in general and about data sharing in particular. And I think they could also make recommendations for adherence to quality systems, such as, for example, the one we are currently developing in the ECRIN consortium, which then potentially could affect funding success as well. Thanks.
Very interesting, thank you. Daniel, may I forward the issue towards the bioethical perspective? Where do you see the most urgent need for actions and, of course, gaps?
Yeah, I think from the really purely ethical and normative side, it is more or less a no-brainer, right? Data sharing has strong ethical rationales, as was already said. It is, of course, partly difficult from a legal perspective, and these points were mentioned as well. We need, of course, consent on what types of consent we accept in clinical research to really also have data donation in the clinical field. But I would say it is also an ethical challenge that maybe we really have to improve training of researchers, and only asking them to share data is of course one side, but the important thing is people need support. They need to be empowered in understanding how to use data sharing platforms, repositories, preprints. We often receive very positive feedback when we provide training courses in this regard, and the already mentioned equipped project, for example, is a good an example in this regard. So from the ethical perspective, I would say we need more practice and support. The theory is clear.
Well, I may add, we have also started this training with our ERA project, and we had so far 2 schools, spring and autumn school, and that was very well received as well. So from our point, we are willing to do, and we have so far succeeded nicely, I have to say. Wiebke, from your regulatory science perspective, what are the critical points to be addressed in translation and the regulatory issues to enhance the value of outcome?
Yes, first of all, I totally agree that training of, for example, regulatory aspects is really needed. And Daniel, maybe we can find some time after this discussion today to see how we can cooperate here together with our STARS consortium to make it even better from our side. But yeah, from my perspective, I really think that beside the training aspects, it is really important to start exchanges between all relevant stakeholders as early as possible during development phases and research projects. So, for example, we often see that the basic researchers are often not aware of what will be relevant from a regulatory perspective later on during the further development process. So my colleague once said we should change the perspectives during the development phase. She said we should start walking a while in another man's shoe, and I think this is really a good picture, because at the very early beginning of projects, researchers should think about what might be relevant later on for further development steps and what kind of requirements they should or can already address from the very beginning, or what kind of research questions they can postpone because they are maybe not relevant for granting a clinical trial application.
Okay, well, thank you. I would now like to come to the question how we can improve the communication between scientists, clinicians, and society, or in other words, what is the most neglected link in this combination? In this communication, where do we need to set focus? Jacques, from your perspective, where would you see the best focus to be placed?
Difficult question, but I think I will give you a double or triple answer. So the first thing that, of course, there are differences between the basic neuroscience and the clinical trials, but both are research. One is exploratory and one is regulated research, but we should have the same level of demand, of expectation regarding the reproducibility, and this is important to discuss with the society and with the patient. Clinical research has a culture of interacting with the patient, not that much with the citizen in general. And I think that training the citizen in medicine and being able to interact with well-trained citizens, able to interact what are the medical challenges is really a must. And I would recommend all the country to implement in the school program, not only the training in medicine, but also in economics and in law, because good citizens should be aware of these three topics.
Right. Well, that goes even further. Thank you. Thomas, how about your viewpoint?
Sorry, I had to unmute first. Yeah, I think I would like to cite an editorial from Linda Westifo and Gerald Phelan in 2011. And they said that scientists ask why and how at an increasingly mechanistic level, while physicians need practical answers to how and what. How is this condition recognized, and what should I do to treat it? And I'd like to add here, the public wants to know, how will science change society? How do we make sure it's done in the right way? What is the outcome? And how does it actually help us to improve quality of life? And that is irrespective whether we talk about basic or applied research. I think people in the different disciplines really need to start talking the same language, as was mentioned earlier by Christina Müller, and be able to better understand each other's goals and requirements. It might need a revision of teaching curricula early on, maybe at schools and universities, and it will benefit from bringing people from different disciplines together, as we did also here earlier on. Also, more consortia involving basic scientists, clinicians, and also patient organizations should be established, such as was mentioned by Marlies Dörlechter at the beginning of the meeting. And research should be more transparent towards the public, comparable to what I think has been more recently achieved with the transparency agreement on animal research driven by ERA, to ensure that the public receives up-to-date and understandable information about key research topics in the neurosciences. I think it could be a condition for future calls, not only as lay information during the application process, but also when results are made public later on. I think funders, but also learned societies, can play very important roles here.
Okay, thank you very much. Coming to a different aspect of that, Daniel, how can we improve the dissemination of the ongoing research and results?
Am I on? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we already pointed here in this conversation to this issue of training, practice. There are the different types of formats, not only peer-reviewed publications, there are data repositories and other venues, but they have to, of course, be accepted and established in the field to then become useful. Maybe as a bioethicist, I'm also allowed to go maybe one step back and say, in some areas with regard to dissemination, we even face some very fundamental conceptual open questions that we haven't clarified yet. For clinical research, it's, for example, quite clear what full results reporting mean. If you have a clinical trial with 200 participants and you publish the results, we expect that you publish results on 200 participants. But in preclinical research, we even lack very basic guidance currently on what full reporting of results would mean. If you have an animal study with 200 animals included, how do we know whether the paper that finally reports 20 or 50 animals, how people decided to only present the results of some groups, of some experiments? We currently lack guidance in this regard. And recent studies found that if you compare study protocols for animal research with the finally reported numbers in publications, you see between 30 and 20% of animals published, but the 70 other animals that were somehow used do not pop up in the scientific publication. So I think here we really need some fundamental debate about what does full reporting, high quality dissemination even mean? And also for pre-registration in animal research, right? It's probably not about asking to pre-register everything in preclinical research, but what about, for example, the very late stage preclinical studies, those that show up in investigator brochures? Maybe we could start here to think about only mention preclinical studies in investigator brochures that have been pre-registered. But again, a really fundamental debate, and we need some more.
Well, that would be certainly a step forward. Yeah. May I take up this full reporting enhancing? Jacques, would this full reporting really enhance the transfer of preclinical results into the clinic? So would that facilitate the step seeking, for instance, ECRIN's consultation?
I think it would secure the decision regarding the clinical trials, meaning that when you start a clinical trial, there's a need for the national competent authority and for the ethics committees to say, okay, the rationale for this trial is valid or not valid. And this is based on the preclinical development. And so I think this would secure the quality of the decision. This would not facilitate the work of the people who have to take the decision, because this preclinical dossier would be a huge amount of information. But I think in the long term, if we want really to secure not only the quality of preclinical research, but to also strengthen the ethics of participation of patients in clinical trials, this is something that has to be improved.
Okay.
Before you say ask the next question, in the last couple of minutes, would you be willing also to take on some questions and comments from the audience?
Ja, of course, this is an open discussion. I see, Frau Zipp, Sie haben die Hand gehoben. Darf ich Sie dann einladen, Ihre Frage zu stellen? Please, to my panelists, we have a question here from the audience, and Professor Zipp is in our SRB, and she raised her hand and would like to ask you a question.
So I would like to say that unlike Daniel Strech, I think one shouldn't put most studies under a general suspicion of wrong data, and to the animal experiments and animal discoveries and data, there are more and more journals asking for original data, like the Journal of Clinical Investigation wants to have prior to publication all original data. I think there are already controls in place, and I think a lot of scientific results have to be taken as true. And I think in academia, we should now not block ourselves, and we should not lose clinician scientists to the US or leave all progress to big pharma working on own validated targets. And therefore, concerning enhancing reproducibility, I would rather like to ask someone from big pharma, Thomas Steckler, what would you suggest exactly for reproducibility? Because I think it just needs another study to show the same. This is very easy, and one should really not put all results under a general suspicion of wrong results.
Right.
Thomas, you like to?
Yeah, I can briefly answer that. I think actually I would rather take the position of Daniel here in that perspective. When it comes to preclinical data generated in animal studies, it is not about necessarily wrongdoing. Yeah? It's not that people start to invent data. It's about studies that, as Daniel pointed out, being not properly powered, yeah? Not blinded, not randomized. So the basic principles that people do not adhere to, and as a result, you will see that there's a bias in the field, and that's studied. You can find this also in publications, that if you have those studies that do not report on blinding and randomization, then you will see that there is a higher number of positive outcomes being reported. You will also see that underpowered studies have a higher risk of showing these overestimated results or false positives. And you will also see that there is in general a high degree of positive results being reported in the literature. Pre-registration, and that has been shown, counteracts this effect to a certain level. And if you look at journals that allow pre-registration, you see that the number of studies that report negative results has dramatically increased. It's still not optimal, but people have an easier time, I would say, to publish their negative results. So all this comes into play. From an industry perspective, as I said initially, we really would like to see robust data. It's important because it's not about data that confirm our initial hypothesis, yeah, which is often the suspicion, in particular in the academic field, because this is not the purpose of the exercise here. What we want to have is to be in a position that allows fast go no-go decisions, because there's a huge financial investment as well as other resources that are potentially wasted, and that we could better use in other projects if we would see more value here.
Yeah, so we have time is almost up. Jean-Antoine Giraud, if you have a very quick question, please, you have 30 seconds.
It's on a different topic. I sent it out. Oh, sorry. I sent it also through the chat. It's about anonymization and DNA material. I mean, DNA is by definition is not anonymous. Once you know the DNA sequence of someone, you can identify that person in principle. So what are the rules and regulations and ideas about this? Because more and more studies will include some sequence from patients.
Maybe I can give a quick answer. Yeah. There are different techniques to share pseudonymized data set, meaning the first, for genomic sequences, there is a technique called the beacon technique that was developed by Elixir, so I cannot describe it here. But yes, there are techniques to share the DNA sequences. And there is another question on the chat regarding the neuroimaging data. So it's possible to anonymize the data. So there are anonymization technique for imaging. There are also anonymization technique for multi-omics and so on. Just by introducing some variability in the data, you can share the data because you can consider that the data are no longer pseudonymized but anonymized, and in this case it's possible to share them.
Well, that was really quick. Thank you very much. So We are at the end of our today's discussion, but certainly not at the end of the process. I like to indeed thank all the panelists for their most valuable contributions. There are points mentioned and issues identified to be carefully considered in our future 5 years work. And so thank you very much for your time and efforts. The discussion was recorded and will shortly be available at our website. Thank you again, and bye-bye.